Hello everybody and welcome to our presentation today. Today we're going to be talking about the intersection between DevOps and security. So what is DevOps? DevOps is primarily a cultural change that includes practices that you change and tools that are supporting those practices and that cultural change. The whole goal is to automate the software delivery lifecycle where you are able to increase speed and quality at the same time. So what does this mean for security? Typically, security was placed right at the end of the software delivery lifecycle, almost right before it was placed into production. Security maybe took manual testing. In the releases that I've done in the past that took maybe a year, year and a half, security actually took up to a month of manual testing. And at that point, security produced a report, developers looked at the report, there was a lot of hand waving, an inability to fix the problems, especially the major ones that took a long time to remediate, and really those were delayed until the next release. So with DevOps, the great thing for security pros is this fundamentally changes how we work and how then we need to choose the tools that will help us secure applications before it gets released out into production. So with DevOps, first step being agile transformation, where our developers are breaking their problems into smaller and smaller pieces. The goal here is to have continuous releases. Continuous small changes that are going out into production. And the way that the DevOps works is they do this, the complementary tools are inserted to then automate all the different processes and all the different steps. Well, now security pros can take advantage of this by putting the automated security tests inside of those tools, those developer native tools, operations native tools. They can put them in so that they can get run automatically as well. That enables security to be just another quality check and enables continuous delivery of secure applications. Now, when we think about DevOps, there are teams that get created for the implementation of it, and they are what I call integrated product teams. And integrated product teams really breaks down the silos that we used to have. So we used to have developers and operations, testing folks in a separate silo, and what we were doing there was really optimizing on those particular functions. We felt like we could get better developers by herding them all together and allowing them to create best practices amongst themselves. Same with testing, same with operations. And security, of course, is one of those silos. Well, today with integrated product teams, what it does is it creates a team focused on the success of a single product or service. And at this point, we can include security folks as a part of this team, or more likely, you're going to create a community of practice of security folks that then supports each integrated product team. And I say that because the application security folks are few and far between. It's most likely you're just not going to have enough application security people to dedicate a particular person to an integrated product team. And the integrated product team, of course, includes those developers and operations and QA folks, and then, of course, security. Once again, probably acting as a community of practice so that you can get advice. You know, security moves from this day-to-day interaction because of the automated testing. They can evolve to really become a more governance community of practice rather than the day-to-day remediation advice, for example, that may be needed. So really these integrated product teams focused on the success of a product or service include security, whether directly by having a person assigned or more likely having someone a contact in your community of practice. Now, I mentioned that DevOps is really here because it's trying to deliver smaller changes faster, so getting quality releases at speed. And what we find is that about 33% of teams release monthly or faster. Now, for security pros, this means you have to change the way you do tool selection. If you've got a development team releasing one release a day, for example, you can't have a static test, for example, or a dynamic test that runs for several days. It's just not going to meet the speed need that developers have today. So the goal is to move the testing as early in the software delivery lifecycle as possible, to give early remediation advice to developers, to tell them, ooh, this may be a vulnerability or a weakness you need to remediate, so that they can do it quickly and then meet these development speeds. But of course, it also means that our testing tools have to be fast. They have to insert themselves into developer native tools to also meet these speeds. Now, where is security putting on the brakes? Pretty much if you use the word manual, you're putting on the brakes. Now, this is a value stream map, which is basically a mapping of everything from ideation out to release, and you associate time with each of these steps. And this is a general example, but in this example what we found was actually that it was the handoffs between the different phases that actually took up the time, not necessarily the actual steps. But when you look at this and you say, okay, where is security putting on the brakes? Now, it could be between the handoffs. Perhaps it's a manual kickoff of a test. Or maybe it's inside one of these phases. So for example, if you're doing manual code reviews, looking for security vulnerabilities or weaknesses, that could also be extending time. And the whole goal is for security pros to look at the time that it is taking between these steps or between the handoffs and say, okay, what can we do to speed this up? Certainly putting in automated testing is going to help with the actual step, but also the ability to insert them into the continuous delivery pipeline, those tools that kick off different phases. For example, build tools like Jenkins can kick off different security testing tools, and that will also help. So where should you start? The first thing you should take a look at is what apps have your biggest impacts in terms of the business. If this app were to die or get breached, what kind of customer impact does it have? The next one is which teams are adopting DevOps. That's where the business has really decided that's where we're putting our money to improve tools and practices. And then the last thing is, maybe you've done some previous testing. Certainly some of the certifications you may need, maybe for PCI, for example, you've had to do some pen testing, and that may indicate which applications are most vulnerable. And what this is doing is this is giving you an overall risk assessment of your apps. And if you're like many companies, you've got many different kinds of apps, and so you're really trying to target the ones that have the most risk. Pick your top 1, 2, possibly 3, no more than that, to really target your application security testing improvements on. Now, you might have several different types of applications, and I've categorized them into these 3 buckets. The first one is the modern app, where it's really heavily open source components, not much proprietary. What we've seen in a modern app is that it can be composed up to 90% in open source components. Legacy apps, on the other hand, are totally flipped, where they've got 10% of open source and 90% of proprietary code. And then I've got these composite apps, and that's where you've got 70% you're getting from somewhere else, and up to maybe 30% you guys are developing in-house. Now, there's lots of different testing tools that you can implement across the software delivery lifecycle. The first one, of course, is static. That's really for your proprietary code. Software composition analysis, that's a must for open source to try to find vulnerabilities. Then you've got dynamic testing, and I get asked a lot, Amy, why do I need SAST and DAST? Why do I need to do static and dynamic? Well, the fact of the matter is static still finds defects that DAST can't, and also vice versa. So, for example, with automatically generated code, DAST is the only tool that's going to be able to find it, and issues like CSRF can only be found with SAST. IAST is a little bit interesting. That is interactive application security testing, and it resembles both SAST and DAST. It really eventually will probably replace DAST testing. It does put an agent out on the basically testing systems, and it watches testing be performed. And the reason I think it will replace DAST is because it doesn't add any security time. DAST usually needs a crawler. IAST can work with any functional testing, including, of course, your regular business testing, like with Selenium, for example. And then the last is mobile testing, which is evolving out of SAST and DAST and IAST specifically for mobile applications. And when you look at these tools, you need to look at what programming language you're using, how do you integrate with the SDLC, because really what you're trying to do is integrate once again into those developer native tools. So let's talk a moment about open source and why it's so incredibly important to watch it. Now, first of all, if you've got the modern apps, you've got 90% of open source up to, and that may be the biggest source of your, that represents the risk in your applications. And the reason it's so important is just last year alone, 3,623 vulnerabilities, new vulnerabilities were discovered, and that was a 10% increase over the previous year. So I don't think it's because we're writing worse code, but we are getting better at identifying vulnerabilities. Unfortunately, not better at identifying them pre-release, which is what we need to do. So when you talk about risk, if you've got a modern app, definitely start with software composition analysis. If you've got a legacy app, you need to start with static, or even put something out in the production environment. A RAS tool, a runtime production, or WAF may be good for handling kind of that default, hey, we want to protect our app. And then Composite, you can start with any of the above, depending on what's presenting the most risk. You know, whether it's open source, you know, third party, obviously you want to make sure that you're not exposing any vulnerabilities there. The key takeaways here is DevOps is really providing security to folks to do continuous application security testing. Start with the most risk. Analyze which kinds of applications you have, and then determine what testing you should perform. Shift all of it left. The earlier you can give remediation advice to your developers, the better. Gives them the greatest chance to fix it, and quickly. And then make sure that the technology choices that you are making support your automation and your application types. And now I'm going to hand it off to Jill for some polling.
Thank you very much, Amy. And as Amy mentioned, we are now going to run a couple of quick polls so we can get some interaction. And our first poll, I'm just going to launch onto the screen for you. And the poll is, how much open source do you have in production? And all you need to do is just select one of the responses there, 25, 50, 75%, or 100. Just click on the radial dial against the most appropriate answer and click submit at the bottom. And I can see that you're all really quick at putting those responses in. Just give you another moment or so, and then we'll close that poll and share the results with you before we move on to the next one. Okay, I'm now going to close that poll and share the results with you. And you can see that 25% is the highest, with 50% of your audience voting, and then 29% against 50, 18% against 75, and 4% against 100. So now we'll move on to our next poll. And our next poll question is, when working with open source, what are you most concerned about? And again, please just select one of those 4 responses there and click submit at the bottom. Okay, so you've all got the hang of this, and the votes coming in really quickly. We've got a nice large audience on the line today. So just another couple of moments, and then we can close this poll and share the results with you. Up to 75% of you have voted now, so I'm now just going to close the poll and again share the results with you. And you can see again, we're working top to bottom. Security 53%, licensing 38%, quality 9%, and nothing against other. And now just hide that and move on to our final poll. And our final poll today is, how are you managing your open source? And on this one, you can select all that apply, and then just click on the radial dials against each option, and then click submit at the bottom. And just again, give you a moment so that you have an opportunity to put your results in. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Just a couple more moments, and then again we'll close the poll and share the results with you. Thank you very much. And the response here is 34% against code scanning, continuous management tool 19%, Excel 25%, we don't manage open source 19%, and other at 25%. So now what I'm going to do is we're now just going to hand over to our next presenter, and we're just handing over to Rami Sass. So Rami, you are now in control, so please do go ahead.
Right, thank you, Jill, thank you so much, and many thanks to Amy as well for sharing all of those interesting insight and your vast experience with us. Let me try and just coordinate with the slide being flipped here. There's some delay. Over the next few minutes, I will talk to you first about a short intro to WhiteSource as a company, where we came from, what we're doing, and then try to drill a little deeper into some of the issues raised by Amy, especially around how you should think about managing the consumption of open source by your software engineers, and how security aspects should be baked into the DevOps processes as early as possible, and why that's important, and what sort of benefits you can get out of shifting left in the security testing and doing them as an integral part of the SDLC. So with that, a quick review of WhiteSource. So we are 6 years old now. We were actually founded based off of a personal experience by the founders. We have 3 co-founders who know each other from a previous company that was going through a due diligence and found ourselves spending a lot of effort and being exposed to a lot of risk around open source during this very stressful time of a due diligence, and it seemed unreasonable to us to only start thinking about open source and start managing that part of our application at that point in time. And it seemed that there should be tools to help you govern and manage the open source consumption by software engineering during the engineering process itself, where you can still react to issues and not sort of be faced with them as an end result when you have to provide a report or go through some very meaningful transaction. We've been very successful up till now, growing at over 300% for the last 3 years in a row. Just now coming off of a Series B funding round where Microsoft is one of the investors. We have 3 active OEMs, so you can see that we have a very prolific ecosystem around us, besides just looking at the dynamic of the market that's changed. And we are also very happy to work with all of these great partners. And we are now very dramatically expanding. We already have offices in Israel, New York, and Boston. Originally, the company is Israeli, and so are the founders. We were basically the pioneers of this space in terms of software composition analysis space, where we made the transition from scanning code into monitoring the open source components, the libraries that were being used by developers. Again, sort of to complement what Amy has remarked on earlier, especially to accommodate for speed, because you cannot scan your code quickly. That's not something that can go into an integral part of a CI process or some continuous monitoring process, whereas if you look at the components, that's something you can and should, in fact, do continuously. So that's what the company was founded on, and that's what we've been doing ever since. I'm trying to switch the slide. Yes, good. This is a very partial list of our customers. The point of these logos basically is to show that everyone developing software is very heavily relying on open source, and everyone needs to manage their open source consumption, irrespective of a vertical, technology, size, geography. Everyone, everywhere is using open source very extensively and needs to watch what they are doing and make sure that they are securing their use of open source, again, as early as possible in the development lifecycle. Again, to extend on Amy's remark from before, in much the same way that software is eating the world, open source is eating software. So you see, Amy previously referred to it as modern. Anything new is modern. You're not going to see an uptake in legacy software. What's considered modern today is going to be legacy 10 years from now, and it doesn't look like open source is going anywhere. If anything, we're going to see more and more adoption of open source components by software developers. Trying to switch a slide. Hopefully it will react. Right. So we were very recently featured in a Forrester Wave report reviewing this market of software composition analysis, and were found to have the best product offering. Specifically, we have the broadest coverage of security vulnerability and the ability to provide remediation advice. I will touch on all of that in a minute. We are also providing very extensive tools to help you enforce your organizational policies throughout the development lifecycle, so you have a very clear view of A, what you want to accomplish around open source, and B, where the exceptions are, and C, the ability to automatically enforce, use WhiteSource to automatically enforce your policy, again, as early as you are able to integrate our tool into your development environment. And that's how you can achieve that shift left effect and be efficient with your development resources and not waste a lot of cycles just trying to test and do security analysis of your applications post hoc. Okay, that's so far about the company. We'll now discuss the benefits of shifting left, the security testing inside the DevOps processes. So very briefly, talk about the concept of shift left. When we say shift left, what we actually mean is that it's much cheaper and much easier to tackle any issue in the software, not necessarily around open source. It could be something with the proprietary code itself. It would still be much easier and cheaper to handle it earlier in the process while the developers are still, I would even go another step to the left here and say planning or design step, certainly during implementation. And the more you go to the right, the higher the cost is and the greater the complication is to deal with these issues. Right, so you are much better off catching a vulnerable open source component at the implementation stage rather than when it's already in production. It's very painful to take a component out of a running application. You have to maybe stop the service, you maybe have to do a recall, or at the very least release a new version or a patch. And all of those activities are very complex and expensive. Whereas identifying something during coding and then just having the developer replace the problematic component is not as complicated and relatively easy to do. DevOps itself, again, as Amy mentioned before, is more of a cycle than it is an arrow, right? You keep doing release cycles, and more modern applications would do shorter and shorter release cycles to be able to deliver faster and more quality software back into their market and provide their customers with better service and better applications and more features faster than ever before, still you'd want these applications to be secure, and you need to bake security into your DevOps processes in order for them to be effective and not waste time on security testing later on in the process. A note about open source here. So there are open source considerations throughout the development lifecycle, much in the same way that today any software engineering team, before even writing the first line of code, would have a full stack of tools to monitor their own proprietary code, like bug tracker, IDEs, build tools, repositories, etc. You should, or any engineering team should, implement the same level of monitoring, the same level of tracking with automated tools for the open source part of their application, which, as we talked about, will, in modern application, comprise out of the majority or sometimes even almost all of the application code base. Right, so what are the important things you should be aware of when you are baking security into your DevOps processes? And I think maybe the first thing to remember here is that the open source community is actually very good at quickly identifying security issues and pushing out remediations or fixes or patches or upgrades. And normally, a well-maintained community will do a very good job around securing their project. The bad news is that the end user, the software engineers, are not really connected to the community, or not to all of the communities of all of the open source components, because there are hundreds and hundreds of open source components in an average commercial application. And it's not feasible for the developers to always be in touch with all of the different communities who do all of that important work around security. So generally, there is a very large disconnect between the good work done in the community and what the developers end up enjoying. And the easiest way to bridge that gap and to fill that disconnect is to use an automated tool to communicate, to sort of provide a communications channel between the community and when they find security issues and fix them, and transmit that information as quickly as possible to the developers who are making use of the open source components. Okay, so in fact, an automated tool is the only practical way for developers to continuously monitor all the different projects, the different open source communities, and be aware of the security issues that are being discovered and get advice on what they should do in order to fix those issues, or at the very least, mitigate them. Okay, so back to our tool and what it can do for you. So we are we are strong believers in shifting left and finding out problematic open source components as early in the process as possible. And what we're seeing now is sort of a screenshot of what we call the selection tool, which is a browser plugin that lets you, or lets the developers, or actually it automatically does various research activities for the developers while they are still researching what open source component they want to use. So a developer would browse the web and look for the best open source component to serve their needs from a functional point of view, and then our plugin would pop up and provide all of the relevant metadata around how that open source component is in terms of security, compliance, how it fits in with the organizational policy, what its quality is, and whether or not other members of my team or different teams in my organization may already be utilizing this component, or if there are newer versions that are being utilized, and so on. So even before all of the other steps in the processes of implementation and building and testing and releasing and deploying and so on, just at the selection phase, you can already have an impact on the developers and make sure that they are making better choices for their open source components. Now, having said that, naturally, the tool also integrates with all the other development environments and the development tools so as to provide 360-degree coverage throughout the development lifecycle, from inception to maintenance. We're able to plug into basically all the popular environments to make sure that you are keeping your application healthy in terms of open source every step of the way. I'm trying to flip. Okay, good. We also cover the largest amount of programming languages and essentially can give you a full coverage of whatever you're using, because the larger the organization is, normally you would see more and more different programming languages used by different teams. Sometimes companies grow by mergers or acquisitions, or have different specialties or different teams working on different projects in disparate locations, and they would resort to using whatever programming language best fits their needs, again, from a functional point of view, because that's how developers make their choices. So we are here to help them support whatever decision they make in terms of programming language. We would have them covered. And then some more details about how we ranked so high in terms of security coverage and how we build our database. So we have actually developed a proprietary system that can automatically make the connection or match reported security vulnerabilities from an online database to a specific open source file inside our very large database of open source projects and components and files that we continuously maintain and curate. And because we do that automatically, then we can very easily scale that up and cover 12 different security databases. So naturally we cover NVD, but then also 11 other smaller, more niche databases, and we do that automatically. So we actually collect a lot of data that may never get to NVD or is released in those smaller databases several months before they go on NVD. And the other thing we do to complement that is that we also go out and mine different databases, not necessarily even databases, it would be security forms and other publicly available data sources for remediation advice. Okay, so we would complement the vulnerability information with advice on what you should do in order to mitigate the problem. And you know, on average, the most popular recommendation would be to upgrade to a newer version, but that's not always the case. Many times you would see recommendations to maybe patch the operating system, or just change a few lines of code, or not call a specific method. So we have a variety of different advice that can fit different use cases and different scenarios in the development environment. Okay, so to recap, basically the world has changed, the software world has changed, and today it's much more reliant on open source than it used to be, so much so that an average commercial software is comprised primarily of open source and only secondary from proprietary code. And watching your open source consumption is become imperative, especially for security, and baking that security aspect into your DevOps process and catching the security issues as early as possible in your process will make your life much easier and put you on the right track to be preventative and not spend so much resources on security issues rather than being corrective and trying to post hoc after the fact, go and fix the issue. And that will also help you reduce a lot of the friction between the security teams and the engineering teams, which is a derivative of having the security guys always check these issues very late in the process. So again, that would be our recommendation, is for you to try and bake the security considerations early in the DevOps process and make sure that you are catching these problems early while they are still small and cheap and easy to fix. And with that, I will give control over to Sam for us to see a short demo.
Hi everyone, this is Sam Guckenheimer at Microsoft. I'm not going to use more slides, but I'm going to start directly showing you what you get using WhiteSource. I will say that just to set context, I don't know how many of you on the call are using our Visual Studio Team Services, or VSTS that is, or Team Foundation Server, TFS. I am, and what I'm showing you is the WhiteSource extension that fits into VSTS called Volt. I'm starting with the results, and then I'll go back and show you how I get these results. So I just ran a build 4 minutes ago while Rami was talking. It ran for a little under 7 minutes. And at the end of the build, this is what WhiteSource tells me. It tells me that in my project, my app, I have 688 components I'm using, mostly in this case from Node, that don't have vulnerabilities. 12 do. And on the WhiteSource report, you can see for each of the vulnerabilities, I have the source of the information, and I have a recommended top fix. So, for example, for this one, shell quote, there is a link here to a Node security advisory that tells me, hey, here's the problem. Here's the current problem with shell quote. Here's what you do in your JavaScript, and lets me know as a developer exactly what to do to fix that. Now, what's very cool about that particular instance, if you notice, is that this little link right here to the source comes from the WhiteSource research that Rami talked about, that database that WhiteSource has. The next one around Hawk is tagged with CVE. That's a common vulnerability enumeration from the National Vulnerability Database, the NVD. So that one's widely known. But because WhiteSource crawls the web and collects these the vulnerability information from the other sites and from the forums and so forth, all of these that are tagged WS for WhiteSource, all of these are things I wouldn't know if I were just using the feed from the NVD database. And that's true here for some of the high vulnerabilities. It's true for some of the medium vulnerabilities and so forth. So that's one of the very cool things about using WhiteSource. Now, what did I need to do to get this? Well, this is run inside a build definition in VSTS. If you don't know what a build definition looks like in VSTS, this is what that one does. So it has 5 tasks: get sources, do a restore and publish, run Volt, publish test results, and push the artifacts. Now, I just put this Bolt task in here by getting it from the available tasks I have and adding it to that build definition. And when I did that, I didn't have to set anything. Everything defaulted for me. So I had a build definition that I could use that would just run against that project. And this is a, this is an open source project, that demo project on GitHub. And as typically happens, it has a bunch of vulnerabilities. And the thing that Rami and Amy didn't say that I will share with you is that although there are all these techniques for improving your security, the greatest actual rate of data breaches come from bad actors scanning for the presence of known vulnerabilities in known open source. If you look, for example, at the Verizon Data Breach Intelligence Report, 80% of the actual data breaches came from cases where people had deployed with known vulnerabilities. So we think this is important. We think it should be easy. WhiteSource Bolt does make it easy. Now, how do you get this? Well, if you're using Visual Studio Team Services or TFS, there is an extensions marketplace, marketplace.visualstudio.com. In there, you can search, and one of those extensions is WhiteSource Bolt, and that is what I just showed you that live that plugs in. You can download for TFS or install for VSTS, and that's available to you today. You can get going today. If you're a Visual Studio Enterprise subscriber, you also can get 6 months use of Bolt included with your subscription by going to myvisualstudio.com. And if you're not using VSTS, Visual Studio Team Services, but want to give it a try, go to visualstudio.com and look in the middle and click Get Started for free. So that's the end of my commercial. The demo is basically showing you, here's what it looks like using open source. Here's how easy it is to use in the pipeline. You can get results fast enough that you can act on them immediately, and it fits in a CI/CD pipeline, and we fit it into ours, and we like it enough that Microsoft just invested in WhiteSource, as Rami mentioned. So I'm going to stop talking, and let's see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Sam. And as Sam mentioned, we're now going to begin taking any questions that we have from our audience today. We've got a couple in already, but as a reminder, if you would like to submit a question, please do type that into the questions box on your attendee control panel. And we've got a question here from Dan from New York. He's saying, nice demo, Sam. I'm interested in knowing what were your most important evaluation criteria when considering an open source management tool?
Right. So I think they're basically two high-level criteria. How good is the coverage of the tool or service against the potential open source vulnerabilities, and how well does it fit into a DevOps flow? So in terms of number one, the coverage against the open source, potential open source vulnerabilities, we evaluated, I think, 8 offerings here, and WhiteSource came out on top in terms of its coverage of open source. This is a combination of the quality of the database Rami described and the agent technology that they use to pass the fingerprints of the components back to their database to give you the sort of thing I'm sharing on the screen. In terms of the second criterion, how well they fit into the DevOps flow, well, you see right here, I'm looking at a build that took 7 minutes, and for the whole build, including compilation and some testing, and the here is the what I got out of WhiteSource, which scanned in the process 700 components that were in my app. So I think this kind of fluid ability to use a tool in your continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline is absolutely essential, and I think WhiteSource has done a great job on that. So those are the two headlines. We could double click into any of those if someone would like to go further.
Thank you very much, Sam. And the next question that we've got in, and Rami, it's for you. It's from Mark from Boston. He's saying, Rami, congratulations on the 10 million funding. Now that you are a Microsoft portfolio company, will you serve Microsoft interests more than before?
Right. Thank you, first of all, for your congratulations. I'm not sure exactly what the interest you're referring to, but Microsoft has been our partner prior to the investment. In fact, their involvement with our funding round was a result of our partnership and not the other way around. And we're very happy to be working with Microsoft. But we also are very eminent on maintaining integration capabilities with all the ALM vendors, with all the popular tools in the market, and we will continue to serve all technologies. That's been our prime directive since the company got started and what got us this far, and that's not something that's going to change.
May I jump in on that, Rami?
Please.
Yeah, so from a Microsoft standpoint, the most valuable thing is that WhiteSource continue to do a great job across the open source community. The thing that we are interested in is having the ability for our customers, our users, to have open source scanning as part of their continuous integration and continuous delivery. That means all open source. So the better the language coverage for the service, the better for our customers. And there is no desire on our part to change the quality with which WhiteSource covers Java and Node and Python and so forth, and all of the other languages. We think those are all relevant. We think that they are all important for modern DevOps, and it's important to have a great CI/CD pipeline there. And for all of them, there is a risk of vulnerability through open source. So for all of them, you can move faster and safer by using this combination, and that's what we hope to do.
Thank you very much. And that is all the questions that we got in from your audience today. So Rami, if I could just hand back to you for any closing remarks before we end today's webinar.
Right, so I would just like to thank everyone for joining us today, and especially Amy and Sam for taking the time and sharing all of their insights and experience with us. It's been great, and I hope to see everyone again. in the near future.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to add my thanks to all of our presenters today and to thank you all for attending. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation. It's just a couple of really quick questions. So we would be grateful if you could keep your browser window open and complete that and provide your feedback for us. As we mentioned, you will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours, which will include a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of WhiteSource and our presenters, thank you so much for joining us, and please do enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.